What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And live from the winter meetings one last time. Yes, the encore is Steve Gelbs. Who else? Gelbs, what's going on? How are we feeling day 3? Is this survival mode right now?
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Especially when it started the way that it did. You know, there was no slow build here. It just started at the apex, and then nothing's really happened since. So it's time to go back. And it's time to go back and go to that press conference. We're going right there tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm getting major, stuck in Vegas vibes right now when you've just had enough and you do anything to be back in your bed. But we appreciate you giving us some time before you fly back for the press conference that we can't wait for to introduce Juan Soto. Speaking of Juan Soto, Gelbs, what do you think it says about the state of the Mets organization that he chose the Mets over other mega offers? I mean, I know they weren't equal at the end of the day, but you've been around the Mets through wildly different eras now, and this moment just felt so gigantic.
Yeah, it's been used a couple of times this week, and I know Steve and Alex Cohen used the word in their statement today when the deal got officially announced, but it's a seminal moment in franchise history, and it's a seminal moment in the history of New York baseball and the history of sports. And I think that, aside from the obvious fact of the Mets adding a generational talent, my biggest takeaway from this signing and from this few days here in Dallas is how clearly the perception now of the Mets organization has done a complete 180. The offers, as you said, were not apples to apples. They weren't exactly the same, but they were pretty darn close, especially between the Mets and the Yankees. And he ultimately looked at both organizations and he said, you know what? I'm choosing the Mets. And that has never happened in my lifetime. There has never been a time where a big-time free agent looked at the future of both organizations and said, you know what? I think the Mets might be the better play here. And I think it just goes to show what the Mets have built, what they are continuing to build, what they proved to a lot of people last year that I think goes beyond just the financial might of Steve Cohen. Because, listen, he's had the financial might his entire time, and it's led to some positive results. But he hasn't gotten the guy every single time, and he won't get the guy every single time in the future. But I think what has happened is players have seen, players have talked, players have taken notice that this organization is pretty stable, is committed to winning, is committed to building a great culture. And then you add the cherry on top of Steve Cohen's financial might, and it becomes a pretty attractive destination, if not the most attractive destination in Major League Baseball.
Steve, when you step away from Soto for a second, because obviously that's the big story, but as this world goes, it's on to what's next. When you evaluate the Mets rotation and the likelihood of it primarily being a 6-man rotation, probably with Kodai Senga coming back and Clay Holmes getting built up to have an actual innings count at this point, how many more starters do you think they need to add this winter?
For me, I would add at least 2 more starters. It doesn't sound like that is something that the Mets are necessarily thinking, although David Stearns plays a lot close to the vest. But he did make it seem like they'd probably be okay adding 1 more starter. And I think the ideal situation would be to add 1 more starter and then have Roki Sasaki choose you. But as Stearns told us yesterday on set, you have to go about your business the rest of the offseason as if you don't have Sasaki, and then if he does choose you, it's just an added bonus. But for me, I think certainly minimum 1 bona fide starter. But if you could add 2, given the fact that they want to have a 6-man rotation, and quite frankly, given the fact that again there are question marks, and last year Severino and Manaea, they worked out beyond everybody's wildest dreams. If you could have taken every scenario and run it through the simulation 1,000 times, that scenario that worked out for them was probably the top 1 or 2. It's the as Jeremy Hefner used to say, it's the top 1 percentile of what could have happened. And it's not to say that Frankie Montas and Clay Holmes cannot do something similar, but to count on them to do what we saw from Manaea and Severino in a team that is clearly all in to win the World Series, that to me is a little suspect. So I think they need to add at least one more bona fide top of the rotation, sure thing, as sure a thing as you can get in a starting pitcher. I think Sean Manaea would be great if they were open to a reunion on both sides and they could make something work. But something along those lines is what I think they need. And again, given the fact that they are probably going to go with the 6-man rotation most of the year, 2 starters would be fantastic.
Back to the lineup, Steve, there's so much back and forth on the Pete Alonso situation. I think because of his playoff heroics, a lot of the fan base wants him back. They want him in this lineup with Soto now that Soto's in the mix as well. Obviously, we know the scenarios. If he's not back, you could play Vientos at first, on it goes. You could look to add offense elsewhere. You're around this team as much as anyone. Where do you stand on a potential Alonso return? Because obviously it's not as simple as just sign him. There's a lot of math that goes into the term, the AAV. But at the end of the day, number one, how do you see it playing out? But number two, how do you think it should play out?
So, it's so tricky just given the emotional attachment that this fan base has to Pete Alonso and that Pete Alonso has to the fan base and the organization. He is one of the great sluggers already in the history of the New York Mets franchise and certainly had himself, his career highlight moment when it mattered most in the playoffs this year. I've long thought this, have a hard time seeing a scenario where it really does come together. I don't know. Part of it is a gut thing. Nobody's told me this, but I think clearly when you see what Alonso turned down from the Mets, that he is going to be somebody that is out there seeking a big contract, long-term, probably close to $200 million. That's going to be what he wants. And I think that is something both term and AAV-wise that the Mets are probably not going to be comfortable with. And so I think it's going to take some time. Now, if his market develops and somebody's willing to give him that, then I think he's gone. I don't think the Mets are going to match it. I think the Mets would love to bring him back on a number that they have in mind and a term that they have in mind. But if nobody is pushing that or that market's not developing, then what I see happening, given the history of Scott Boras and some of his big name clients that haven't gotten what they've wanted early in off seasons, is I see it being pushed to February or March. And again, if he doesn't get the 5-6 year, $200 million, $180 million deal, then, I think it drags out. And if it's going to drag out to that point, I think there's a decent chance that the Mets make a pivot at some point. And I think that there's a decent chance that it plays out almost in a way that the Braves Freddie Freeman situation played out, where they signed Matt Olson before Freeman signed with the Dodgers. So, if Pete is nowhere close to signing and Christian Walker seems reasonable, do the Mets pivot and go to Christian Walker, thus shutting the door on Pete Alonso? I just think there are a lot of scenarios like that could play out. And to me, again, just gut-wise, make it feel like he's probably going to end up somewhere else. But, I know the Mets would love to have him back, and I know that he would love to be back. It's just, again, the value that the Mets may see for him versus the value that he's trying to get in the timeline. Again, for me, you asked me point blank, what do I think? Do I think he's going to be back, or do I not think he's going to be back? I would say I'd lean to him not being back next year.
You mentioned Manaea a couple minutes ago, and obviously just talking about Alonso. Think about the 2024 Mets. You were with them every day, and they had such great chemistry. And I think in a lot of ways, winning is generally what creates good chemistry. But this clubhouse came together when things got really rough, and persevered and got to where they ultimately did. How do you think David Stearns balances bringing back pieces from that team that gelled so well together versus just purely business, remove all the emotions, all of the stuff from last year? How do you balance that as David Stearns?
It's really tricky.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of conversations this week just amongst ourselves, media types, about the tightrope walk you have to make if you are David Stearns, because there are a lot of pieces that are probably not coming back from that clubhouse. And part of what made them so successful, to your point, is the chemistry and the clubhouse vibe and the way they pushed each other. I have never seen a group as close and as tight knit as that one was. So I think you have to be really careful about removing too many pieces. And that, to me, is why Sean Manaea, if they could find a way, seems like such a good fit, because his ceiling is obviously very high now. We saw the type of change he made last year. I know he loved his time with the Mets. I know the Mets loved him. He was such a big piece of that culture last year. And when you look at the needs on the field, he fits a need on the field. So again, it's about price and match. When you see what Max Fried got, you wonder if there's a realm in which his price point makes sense for the Mets. But I do think that it is something that has to be considered, that you don't want to remove too much from the clubhouse last year. But at the same time, you are still going to have Lindor. You are still going to have Brandon Nimmo. You are still going to have Edwin Diaz. And probably most importantly, you're going to have Carlos Mendoza and David Stearns. And the tone that those two set at the top last year, and then Lindor really helped to pursue and push forward. I think it's becoming something where whoever you bring in understands there's a standard, and that's got to be met both in how you carry yourself and how you work and how you perform on the field. So it's not a real clear answer that I gave you. I think you got to be careful, but I also don't think that at the end of the day, David's going to put so much stock into it that they bring back Iglesias and Winker if they don't feel like they're a fit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Steve, as you know from our many Sundays together, fans don't typically love owners being so hands-on and involved in the operations of the sport. But with the Mets, have you seen a more positive force of Steve and Alex Cohen getting their hands involved in the baseball operations? Because all we hear about when they have meetings is how much of a plus they consistently are, even with the players that they don't get.
Yes, I do. And I think it's because of the way they go about it. So there's an involvement, but there's not a heavy-handedness, if that makes sense. They are not going in there and imposing their will on the baseball operations people, on the manager. They're going in there to lend their support and to show free agents not just that they are willing to financially commit, but that they care about the totality of the experience. And I think that's where, and it's been reported out a little bit, but that's where Alex Cohen probably doesn't get enough credit. One of the first things that she did when the Mets took, or when the Cohens took over ownership of the Mets, was redo the family room at Citi Field to make it what has been described to me as a magical place for kids. I believe there's like rides in there or many, Ferris wheel, something like that. I don't know exactly what it is. I've never been in there, but it's apparently spectacular. And it's those personal little touches that, okay, you want to come to the Mets? Yeah, we're gonna pay you a lot of money, but your family is also going to be welcome here and going to be, these young kids are going to have a wonderful place to be during these games, and just little things like that. And so I think they've done a wonderful job of optimizing what it means to be an involved owner so early in their ownership tenure. They are very into hiring the right people and letting them do their job while offering the most support possible. And then when they are needed to, explain this familial atmosphere and kind of make it feel more personal, they're there as well. And so, yeah, there is no doubt that it has been a monstrous benefit, not just the financial might, but the people themselves in recruiting people to the organization.
Last one for you, Steve. So you could get to sleep. We know you have to get on a plane early in the morning. You have a kind of important press conference I think you need to be at. So last one for you. So after the Soto news dropped on Sunday night, me personally, I thought the Mets would do more in Dallas. I was like, this is going to be a big winter meetings for the Mets. Were you surprised that you are going to sleep and leaving the winter meetings and the Mets did not make another move?
The reason I'm surprised is not because, okay, they went all in on Sunday night and now it's just the dam's going to break and here comes a lot of moves. I've been to enough of these now where oftentimes it feels like there's a lot of buzz, but not a whole heck of a lot gets done. The Soto deal getting done there, that was more news than we've had in the previous 10 years that I've been doing this at the winter meeting.
Since Garrett Cole, basically,
right? Right. But I'm talking just purely from the Mets perspective.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm surprised is because the first day we spoke to David Stearns, he went out of his way to say that there's been more conversation, more activity, and he expected the entire industry to be extremely active. And he said today that he was a little surprised that more didn't happen. So that's really the only reason I'm surprised. But I'm not really all that worried about this being close to the end of the road. I think there are going to be a lot of moves still to come for this team. Again, there is no question that they are all in on this year and next year and the year after that. And they're going to do everything in their power, whether it's signing free agents, making big trades. David Stearns signaled a willingness to trade top prospects in the right deal, which is something he did not signal last year. So I expect there to be a lot of activity. And I expect that tomorrow at 3:00 at Citi Field, that will not be the last time that I'm at Citi Field for some sort of a press conference this offseason.
Steve, you're the best, man. We appreciate the time. We know it's been a crazy couple of days here. We're excited for tomorrow. And I'm excited. We watch Jets-Jaguars together on Sunday. Can't wait to see you soon.
Yeah, it's similar, right? The excitement is similar right now.
Yes. Soto, Jets, Jaguars, Mac Jones. Oh, man. See you, buddy. Get home safe.
I'll see you, man. All right.
Thanks,
Sounds
Steve.
good.
Oh, Joe, I promised
Connor, we agreed beforehand, no Jets talk, and you snuck in an ownership comment. I heard that, and that kind of
closed. Yeah. It's called being a host. Sometimes you need to end on a laugh. No, I absolutely broke the promise. I apologize. All right, Joe. I have some takeaways from that conversation with Steve, which is always one of our favorites as we do at the winter meetings every year. Little surprised, but I mean, obviously, Gelbs has a better feel than anyone with the Mets. The diagnosis of the Pete Alonso situation, I think mistakenly, I am guilty of this, and I feel like a lot of Mets fans are. We got Juan Soto. Now Pete's going to be back. And then you forget this is a business, and it's also a numbers game, and that if Pete, and Gelbs made sure to really emphasize this, if Pete wants to wait months, not weeks, months, for a $200 million-ish deal that isn't going to arrive, the Mets need to take care of their own business, unfortunately, without Pete Alonso. And I think that's something I personally overlooked, and I think it's a really, really fair point. Now, Pete Alonso in the next 3 weeks goes, well, you know what? Let's talk to the Mets again. Let's find common ground. Then that makes a lot more sense. But Pete has waited for free agency, and if he wants to wait this thing out, like we've seen a lot of guys do, mistakenly or not mistakenly, I think of Jordan Montgomery last year, then so be it. So that's number one for me. What did you think of that whole combo, that part?
I did not think much about that. I've been very vocal on this show every opportunity I've got that I thought the signing of Juan Soto increased the chances of Pete Alonso returning, not decreased. But to Steve's point, if he is actually going to wait that long, the Mets can't lose every other alternative option. In this, they're going to be in a win now mode every year, which is something that David Stearns also said earlier today when, he was talking to Steve, and Steve asked, you're in a win now team this year. And he's like, well, we expect to be a win now team every year. You can't lose Christian Walker. You can't lose Nolan Arenado, Alex Bregman, whatever you think of those specific options. You can't lose everybody and then go, well, Pete ended up getting a contract out of our comfort zone, so it's Mark Vientos at first and Brett Beatty at third. I don't think that's something the Mets
That's a good point.
can and should be comfortable with going to spring training. But Connor, as you said, hopefully this is something not necessarily in the coming days, but in the coming weeks, the Mets can get a real answer from Pete Alonso and go to him with what they think is a proper value contract and see if they could find common ground.
It's going to be really, really interesting. That and just the pitching situation, which let's jump right into that. Let's go down on the farm. This is kind of a unique down on the farm segment because Garrett Crochet, the White Sox young ace, although doesn't have a long resume, but I think we all agree he has some of the most upside in baseball on the mound. Traded today to the Boston Red Sox for a package of prospects. For those that don't know, the Red Sox have one of the more high volume, high quality systems in all of baseball right now. So a lot of people felt like they were equipped to have a big offseason to not only get a youth infusion with the big league club, but move some of that youth for more proven pieces. Joe, why I bring this trade up is from a Mets perspective, it's fascinating to me because how does this package look to you? Like what are the pieces? What kind of package was sent to the White Sox in terms of degree of pedigree and overall outlook on these prospects, and how that can affect the Mets trade market if they, and this is throwing a name out there, but we heard they dabbled on Crochet. They obviously didn't get the deal done, but now do they call the Mariners for Luis Castillo to bring up another example of a higher end pitcher?
So I said this on last night's show. So if you all listen live, I said, I think the Mets have a chance to get Garrett Crochet, but if the Boston Red Sox decide they want Garrett Crochet, there's nothing the Mets could do to stop them. And credit to the Red Sox for the farm system that they have built to the point where they were able to keep their top 3 prospects in the system while acquiring Garrett Crochet. The reason for that is they had 4 prospects inside of MLB Pipeline's top 25 and 5 prospects inside, I think it's the top 53 or 54. And they gave up Kyle Teal, former first-round pick catcher, top 25 prospect in the sport. They gave up Braden Montgomery, first-round pick just back in July, a guy that coming into the draft process and throughout the whole season, a lot of people thought he had an outside shot to be the number 1 pick, if not a top 3 or top 4 pick. And then he had an unfortunate injury in the college. I think it was super regionals. He broke his leg sliding into home plate and he dipped just outside the top 10 and the Red Sox took him. And now he's headed to the White Sox and they threw in a couple other pretty good prospects. The reality here is the Mets would have probably had to do Jet Williams and Brandon Sproat.
Wow.
And Luis Angel Acuna to kind of get I would say get in the conversation just from a sheer how they're evaluated as prospect standpoint. And that's obviously something the Mets weren't going to do more likely than not. And, good for the Red Sox considering they don't want to be the high bidder on any free agent. You might as well trade some prospects to get high end talent.
All right. Yeah. Good breakdown, Joe. Because I think when you hear the Mets comparable package, it's like, oh, okay. I mean, you do that and 3 of your top guys from the system are gone and everybody wants major league talent. But I think they also want to be calculated with how they kind of attack this thing.
And Connor, you mentioned Luis Castillo. That's a different conversation because he has big money and it's a 3-year. He has 3 years left with a vesting option.
$77 million, I want to say
something like that. 20 something a year is kind of
32.
Yeah. So older guy. He has years on the contract. He has money on the contract. So if the Mets want to pursue Luis Castillo, it'll cost you something pretty good. But I don't think it's going to cost, flushing your farm system, I don't want to say down the toilet, but flushing your top guys out of the system. I don't think it would take necessarily that.
That's a good call out because Crochet is 25. Castillo turns 32 tomorrow. Happy early birthday, Luis Castillo. Hopefully you're a Met soon. Garrett Crochet is a former 11th overall pick in the draft that just made an all-star team at 25. So, yeah, you're talking about, the White Sox traded somebody that the industry views as an ace. And not saying Castillo's not a great player, but you're right, Joe. You start to think that maybe there could be decline or it's not the same longevity argument. So that it'll be interesting to see his market if they ultimately move him. And the Mariners are a team that they like to move money when they can to make other moves. They don't just operate with far from an endless budget. All right, quick note here before we continue on with what's going on at the end of the winter meetings here. We're thrilled to announce the Mets Pod has been named a finalist for the 2025 Sports Podcast Awards. We are on the short list for Best Baseball Podcast category. Last year, we won silver in that same category, and this year we are going for gold, but it's all up to fan voting. which means it's up to you. And we appreciate everyone so much that has already gotten us here, not once now, but twice. Please visit sportspodcastawards.com. Please give the Mets Pod a vote for Best Baseball Podcast. It goes a long way. Sportspodcastawards.com. Tell your friends, family, coworkers, teachers, strangers on the streets. Just start screaming at them. Just kidding. Don't just politely say, give the Mets Pod a vote for Best Baseball Podcast. We need those votes. We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Joe. Time for a smooth transition to Scott Boras's chaotic press conferences, which have been relatively tame for Scott. I hope he's not losing his fastball on really drumming up his clients. But we got to hear from him today in Dallas. He always brings his signature puns, but we wanted to roll in a clip that is a little bit relatable to the Mets. Take a listen.
I think it's pretty evident that the Mets have decided that they're going to pursue winning and winning for a long time. They have made it very clear to us that they're not limited to signing one great player, but multiple great players. So, that they're going to be, I think, a very steady and heavy commitment to acquiring the best talent.
Let them know, Scott. Let them know. Honestly, though, Joe, listen, this isn't like new just because they signed right. Soto. The Mets have been handing out pretty significant money since the Cohen era has began, and Boras has been part of some of that. But it was an interesting, when you hear that from the most powerful agent in the game, it's not that he's praising them for signing Soto. It's that what we all know is the Mets are not going to stop just because they got Soto, which is probably a big reason why Soto's here.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Connor. He knows not necessarily specifics of the Mets plans, though. Some of them, because he reps Pete Alonso, he reps Sean Manaea, he reps Alex Bregman if the Mets were talking to him. So he's very cognizant of what the Mets are doing because he's a central figure in the sport. But in this pitch to Juan Soto, the Mets had to tell him like an idea of like not necessarily the players that they're going to go sign because you can't guarantee that, but talking about payroll commitments and just the way they have acted. I think there are some people, not many, I think people have kind of caught on, but there are still some out there that are like, oh, they signed Juan Soto. That means they're done with big moves. They are not done with big acquisitions. I think, as Gelbs said just a little while ago, he anticipates more press conferences at Citi Field this winter. So I think we are really just getting started, despite the fact that the winter meetings are coming to a close and the Mets obviously made the acquisition of Juan Soto official today. We're just getting started when it comes to everything the Mets are going to be putting together to make the 2025 Mets a perennial World Series contender.
And we'll have it all covered here. You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss a show. Let's jump into the mailbag. We actually saved one from last night because we liked it so much, from Saint Vintage on YouTube. Can we please bring Wilmer back to get a ring? Laugh out loud. Backup third base, first base. Let him retire a Met. Wilmer Flores, Joe, unfortunately had an OPS under 600 last year, but I do like the idea of Wilmer in some capacity, maybe not actually on the roster, but maybe an alumni event, whatever it is. Wilmer Flores, forever a great Met, Joe.
Is Wilmer Flores like on the verge of retirement age? Or is it just the fact that he had an OPS under 600?
No, he's only 33. Which is wild that Wilmer Flores is 33 because I remember when he signed with the Mets as a teenager.
I remember being in Port St. Lucie right after the Mets signed Wilmer Flores, and I met him as a fan just near the fences, and he had braces on. He's a 16, 17-year-old kid, and now he is a veteran with probably 10 years of big league experience or close to 10 years at this point. So look, love Wilmer Flores. Every time the 5 days of Flushing special comes on SNY, I watch it, and Wilmer will always be remembered for a lot of things for that 2015 team. I just don't think he's necessarily a fit on the 2025 Mets.
No, and his career is far from over. To be fair to Wilmer, he had a season-ending knee injury last year. He had a knee procedure done this offseason, I believe. But in 2023, Wilmer Flores, in 454 plate appearances, had a 863 OPS, which is phenomenal. He hit 23 home runs. Like, the thing with Wilmer is, like you said, Joe, just not a fit for this team, as the Mets are looking for as many guys with position flexibility as plus defenders right now, not necessarily right-handed bats. But there is a world where Wilmer Flores does one day return to the Mets. I would never say never, especially for a legend like Wilmer. Let's keep the mailbag going as we take some live questions here. Here's Noel Eisenberg from YouTube. Noel Eisenberg, who is the one high leverage arm you'd like to see the Mets target for the bullpen? Joe, interesting. This question comes up as Jonathan Loáisiga ends up going back to the Yankees on a one-year deal. That was a high leverage arm we had heard the Mets had interest in.
Yeah. There's so many options, and Jonathan Loáisiga was someone I was a fan of. Every chance I've gotten over the last couple days, I've gone back to an article I wrote like a little over a month ago for SNY for 9 under the radar free agents that the Mets could pursue, and the Mets showed interest in Loáisiga. He was on the list. The Mets met with the agents for Nick Pivetta today, and he was the top of that list. But when you look at this reliever market, there's so many options. If you want to go big, you can go for Tanner Scott. The Mets can afford to do that if they want to. Carlos Estevez, who got traded to the Phillies at midseason, was really good for them in the second half as their closer, and famously gave up a grand slam to Francisco Lindor.
Yeah,
that was pretty important. Yeah, but Carlos Estevez makes a ton of sense.
He had a great year. He had a really great year. There's a reason the Phillies paid what they did to get him.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's a very good reliever. Perhaps he's seeking a closing opportunity, but I would talk to him. David Robertson, despite being 40 years old now, or turning 40 years old, he had the highest strikeout percentage of his career since 2017. So he's clearly not done. He still has something left in the tank. Staying on the Rangers, former Rangers, Kirby Yates, who was their closer, he's back out there in free agency. He was really good. Jose Leclerc. I could go for a while on potential high leverage relievers.
Good
but
names.
what I believe, and kind of to Noel's point here, what the Mets did with the bullpen last year didn't work out necessarily as planned. And I think David Stearns will largely do a lot of that going forward, which is finding different angles, different pitch mixes. So that way it's not just, 5 of the same type of reliever. But I think they really, really need to lock in someone that when the Mets sign him, we come on this show and we say, that's a legitimate 8th inning guy to set up for Diaz. And I just gave you a few options that I think could fit.
They definitely need that guy. And it's such an interesting combo, Joe, because we bring that up. I hear it all the time that, Stearns had a lot of misses with the bullpen last year. The Mets also had a lot of bad luck. The fact that Brooks Raley and Drew Smith both had severe season-ending injuries that are going to obviously carry on into this year, that's really bad luck because those guys were in line for huge roles and started off the season really well. Even it's weird because the acquisition of Stanek was a dud during the regular season, and then he was one of their best relievers in the biggest games of the playoffs. Maton was the opposite. Maton was the best acquisition out of nowhere that they basically just bought a reliever. He got them through a lot of big games to make it to the postseason, and then in the postseason, he ran out of gas entirely. So Stearns has definitely been more hot and cold with the bullpen, but I'm with you. They need one surefire, proven high-leverage guy to Diaz, and then the volume strategy comes into play, and I trust them to figure it out. This is definitely a Joe question from Michael Vega on YouTube. What do you think about losing Vasil and Lavender? Anyone taken in the AAA Rule 5 we should miss? So for those that missed it, both Mike Vasil and Nate Lavender were selected off the Mets organization in the Rule 5 draft.
Yeah, so the Rule 5 draft, for those that are unaware, it's if you don't leave prospects or you don't add prospects to your 40-man roster after a certain amount of time removed from college or high school, they become eligible for the Rule 5 draft, and any team can select that player for the cost of $50,000, and all they have to do is carry them on their big league roster for the entirety of the season, and then they get to keep them going forward and can do whatever they want. So Vasil was drafted by the Phillies, and then shortly thereafter traded to Tampa Bay for cash considerations. The Rule 5 rules follow Vasil to Tampa Bay. So if Vasil makes it through the whole season with Tampa, he is Tampa Bay Ray going forward. But you just have to think about Dead Neil Nunez as an example, that he was drafted from the Mets in the Rule 5 draft by the Giants, had a great spring training, was slated to make the Giants bullpen, then ended up hurting his arm, getting Tommy John surgery, missing the season. And then that following winter, they needed 40-man roster space, so they just sent Nunez back to the Mets, and now Nunez has a chance to be a very high leverage reliever for the Mets. And Nate Lavender, he's going to miss most of this season, maybe closer to all of it after undergoing Tommy John surgery last spring. So the Rays can stash him on the 60-day IL all year and carry over the Rule 5 rules into 2026. So Nate Lavender, Mike Vasil, currently not Mets, but there's a very real possibility because most of the time these guys don't make it through that whole stretch. There's a very real possibility one or both are back with the Mets within the next, call it 12 months.
What is the purpose of the Phillies taking a Mets player in the Rule 5 draft and then immediately trading him for cash?
Getting a little more money, and they weren't going to take someone, so they're just like,
oh, so you just use your...
Yeah.
You
use your slot. So you're basically just like, hey, we're not taking anyone. Does anybody want someone now? And Tampa's like, we'll take Vasil, and maybe they got an extra $25,000 or $50,000 or something like that, and just a little extra money for no reason.
Damn, we got to get in the Rule 5 draft game.
That's, yeah, I know.
It's just an extra $25,000.
The Mets have sold some Rule 5 picks in the past.
All right, our last one today, and thanks everybody for sticking with us. This is our fourth show in a row in terms of our evening shows. We had the Juan Soto coverage Sunday. We've done a winter meeting show live Monday through Wednesday. It's been awesome. Thanks everybody for your questions. And the last one is from Chuck Hurd. What's the plan for DH? I see calls to trade Marte. That was from Will Salmon today, by the way, friend of the show. So who's the fallback? Beatty? Why no free agent DH talk?
Because DHs just generally are not a priority. And I mean, think about the fact that the Mets signed JD Martinez in the middle of early to mid-March last year. Like, it's just teams right now, as you're building your roster, you don't build your roster unless you have Shohei Ohtani. You don't build your roster around a designated hitter. You build your roster, and then you figure out who the right fit for the designated hitter spot is later on in the winter. And that's where, if the Mets do move a Starling Marte, which I always say, if Will Salmon says it, it now has my attention. So perhaps that's something that we need to look at here over the coming weeks, that the Mets may look to attach some of Starling Marte's money and move him to create an opening for something else. And if you talk about designated hitter options, Jesse Winker, of course, you can bring him back. A guy that we probably haven't talked about a lot, but we confused him for David Peterson the other night on the show. I was looking into Jock Peterson today, and I didn't quite realize how good Jock Peterson is.
Every year.
Yeah.
Every year.
Consistently really good on base guy. Typically a pretty good batting average guy, 20 home run pop. Jock Peterson, I think, makes a ton of sense if you're looking to fill a DH spot, come sometime in January. And there'll be other options as well. It just, from a general sense, the designated hitter is not a top priority for teams.
Jock Peterson is one of the best specialists in baseball. Against right-handed pitching, he has a career OPS of 844. And he just does it every single year.
I think I saw he had 37 at bats against lefties this year. They just literally do not play him against lefties. Or something like that.
I'll tell you right now, he had 42 plate appearances, technically 32 at bats.
Yeah.
Shout out to Jock, who in that very limited span had a 749 OPS against lefties, but it's not his forte. The 923 OPS against righties. The splits are insane. 22 home runs, like you said, Joe. 392 on base percentage. It's just insane. I mean,
if you are the Mets, Connor, speed and stolen bases are not going to be a massive part of this lineup. Lindor could steal a bit. Nimmo got a little better at stealing bases as the season wore on, but you're not getting a ton of stolen bases out of him. No. This is going to be an on base and power lineup. So Jock Peterson kind of fits the mold of what this, I think, lineup construction can look like.
I like that call out a lot. I would be a huge fan of adding Jock Peterson to this team. I mean, if he's the DH, sign me up all day. That's a great move. And as we've often We've talked about this with DH, just that, like you said, Joe, it's a market that you can wait on because you could find specialists and you also have in-house options. And we'll see what the Mets do with Marte, because that's probably the first domino that needs to fall. One of the great advantages of the Steve Cohen Mets is they can pay down a contract and get a better return. And maybe the Mets use Marte and their own money to solve high leverage reliever or another starter, or you never know who it's be. And then they go, okay, well, we solved something on the trade market that we didn't like in free agency, but we like the DH market better in free agency. So we'll go use the money for that to replace what we were going to get from Marte, and on it goes. So
it's all a big old math equation, Connor.
Yes. And David Stearns is the master of the puzzle pieces right now and doing quite a job with it. All right, this is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. The Mets will hold a news conference tomorrow, December 12th. Yes, that is Thursday, December 12th, to formally announce the signing of Juan Soto. Owner, chairman, and CEO Steve Cohen, as well as president of baseball operations David Stearns, will welcome Soto to Queens at Citi Field. Everything will be live on SNY tomorrow at 3 p.m. Or if you're listening on Thursday on your podcast feed, that is today at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on SNY. And of course, remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review with a question. We'll look for it for a future mailbag. Of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Please vote for the Mets Pod for Best Baseball Podcast on sportspodcastawards.com. Thank you, everybody that helps us out there. And thank you to our 3 guests during the winter meetings, Andy Martino, Will Salmon, Steve Gelbs, our entire Mets Pod production crew, because these are late nights and they are long shows. And it's a lot of fun, Joe. This is my favorite week of the year for the Mets Pod. It's not just the rumors, the guests, the conversations. It also helps when you start the week getting Juan Soto. It's been a blast, man. So some closing thoughts from you before we wrap up a very eventful and what will continue to be an eventful offseason for the Mets.
As you said, Connor, just thank you to everyone who joined us and everyone behind the scenes that puts everything together. An exciting time for Mets fans. And I just think back to the Carlos Beltran press conferences, the Pedro Martinez press conferences, all these really important times in Mets history. Thursday, SNY, 3 o'clock is another one of those special times. And I cannot wait to see Juan Soto put on that New York Mets hat and that New York Mets number 22 jersey. Thank you all. Go Mets.
Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.